What's up, and welcome back to Gabe Miller Music. Akai recently released the MPC Studio 2, which is a controller for their software, and it has some very obvious similarities to the Native Instruments Maschine Mikro Mk. Both devices are fantastic entry points into a more hands-on beatmaking experience, but there are some key differences that you need to know about before you pull the trigger on one. By the end of this video, you should have a much better idea of which one will be more up your alley. Timestamps will be provided below and in the description if you want to skip around, although I recommend you watch this all the way through because the concepts kind of build on each other to a degree. All that being said, let's start with the similarities. Both of these devices are USB Midi controllers that are lightweight but fairly solid, and as you can see, take up roughly the same footprint, although I should note that the Maschine Mikro is a bit thicker. It tapers a bit towards the back, whereas the MPC Studio is thinner and uniform across its entire width. To be clear, the bodies of both of these devices are plastic. And what I mean by lightweight but fairly sturdy is that I wouldn't hesitate to throw either of these into a backpack to take with me somewhere. I would trust that they'd stay fully intact and all that. They both come with fully featured software that the devices are specifically built to control. When you buy one of these, you're also buying into its ecosystem. With both of these, you will have to spend some time looking at your computer screen and using your mouse to navigate, but they do have hands-on control for primary features where it counts. And there's quite a bit of overlap in terms of what those features are, like recording mechanisms, a bunch of shift commands everywhere. There's quantization, hands-on, selecting different sections, different tracks, and of course, different touch bars and value selection knobs. And tiny little screens. I like the pads on both. The Maschine ones are a bit bigger and flatter and have a bit more give to them. They feel a bit more sensitive, although you can adjust the pad sensitivity in the software. However, the Maschine pads have grown on me a lot over the course of my use of the MPC one. So if you favor MPC style pads, you're going to go for these. If you want something that feels like a little more modern, I guess this is probably going to be the go-to. The beauty is that both of these devices are small, but the pads are quite large, and they do both feel good for finger drumming, and that's really important to me when it comes to a music production device with pads. They've got to be good for finger drumming, and they've got to be big. That's the case for both of these. There are a bunch of subtle differences between these, but I'm going to focus on a few major ones that will affect your experience the most. The first major difference is in how these devices deal with sounds. On the Maschine, each pad can hold an entire plugin. So if I take this kick sample from my $5 sample pack, link in the description, and I drag it into a slot, not only will it populate that slot with a sample, but it'll load up a sampler plugin. And I've got all these settings that I can adjust here. And there's a different view of it in the mixer window. Pretty straightforward. In this case, I'm playing stuff as one-shots. I can also drag an entire synth preset into a pad. In this view, it'll act like a one-shot, but then I can jump into the keyboard, for instance, or chords. That's a bad patch to demonstrate that with, so I've loaded in a different one. Chords. Hopefully you can see where I'm going with this. And if I want to change what the root note is, I can control that on the tiny screen, and I can change what scale I'm in, super hands-on. That's all right there. Pretty straightforward. This is a super fast, intuitive, and importantly, flexible way to work. And pre-made Maschine sound packs take full advantage of this by throwing both samples and synth presets just onto the pads where it makes sense. The way the MPC deals with sounds is a bit more rigid, and in some ways is a holdover from the more classic MPC workflow. You can have drum programs, which is where your one-shot samples will live. You do have a thing called 16 levels, though, which will allow you to pitch something around in a chromatic scale. And you can also lay out, say, different levels of velocity and other stuff like that in 16 levels. However, if you use 16 levels within a drum program, you'll notice these cut each other off. It's monophonic in this mode specifically. And a chromatic scale is all you get. However, that will be different in key group programs, which I'll show you in a second. But first, I want to show you that each of your tracks can be selected using the tiny screen, and you can select the different track types as well. So I've showed you drum programs very briefly for playing one-shots. There are also key group programs. These are what will give you a lot more control when mapping a sample to a keyboard. Key group programs are where you're going to load a sample in to play it as if it's a synth, and you'll have a lot more control over how it behaves, including having nice defined scales to work with. These being separate from the drum program stuff might seem more convoluted than the super streamlined approach that the Maschine takes, and to be fair, it is. But key group programs can have up to 4 layers, and you have full control over the tuning and volumes of all that kind of stuff on each sample, and of course you can process those with amp and filter envelopes, which you also have on Maschine, and external effects. I do this all the time. It's a great way to turn existing sounds into something new and unrecognizable. So, you've already heard this sample. Let me just crank the release a bit. But now, if I select another layer, and I can also do that directly on the device itself, I can pull in another sample. And then I can start to tweak how these samples sound in relation to each other. This brings me to one of the most important takeaways. If you want an emphasis on working with a seamless combination of samples and synths, including iconic synth plugins like Massive and FM8, the Maschine is probably right up your alley. If you want an emphasis on working with samples more in depth, the MPC is probably better for that. You'll see this show up in a few other ways as well. The Maschine's built-in synth plugins, in my opinion, are quite a bit better than the ones in the MPC software, although they're decent in the MPC software as well. And you get plenty of sounds and sound shaping possibilities in both. But stuff like Massive and FM8 are pretty hard to beat. But, of course, you can load your own plugins into either software. Here's another weird difference that shows the MPC's emphasis on sampling. Both pieces of software can do sample chopping, but only the MPC can do it hands-on on the device itself, like this. I have the sample here. So now, I have this. You get the idea. You just don't have that lazy chop feature on the Maschine. I'm not sure why, but that's the way that it is. Another key difference is the presence of Midi in and out. The MPC has it, the Maschine doesn't. This means that you can connect a hardware synthesizer directly to your MPC and control it with that. This also allows you to use one of the MPC software's coolest features, Auto Sampler, which automatically records a bunch of individual notes from a hardware synth and maps them to your keyboard. It can even record notes at different velocities to make playing them with the pads more expressive. You could probably get similar results on Maschine using Contact Instruments, but this is just so easy to do on the MPC. If you're starting to think that I'm praising the MPC and bashing the Maschine, think again. I've mentioned before that the workflow on the Maschine is more fluid than the workflow on the MPC. This pops up in one more very important place: building songs. The MPC is built on song sections called sequences that are entirely separate from each other. If you want to make a new song section that's similar to a previous one, you have to copy that section and then make changes. But let's say you want to go back and change a part in both sections. You have to go through the effort of changing it in both places. If you've got a bunch of subtly different song sections, that can add up. So I usually make sure that I'm good with how everything is sounding before I flesh out a loop or two into a full track. And if you'd rather just export the stems from the MPC to a different DAW like Reaper or Ableton, the process is just more convoluted than it is on the Maschine, where it's super straightforward. Unlike the MPC, the Maschine is pattern-based, much more like Ableton. So I can make a bunch of pattern in each of my banks. In this case, I've only got 2 groups loaded up here, but I can make a bunch of patterns containing a bunch of variations and then build up song sections by assigning those patterns to scenes. So the same pattern can be present in multiple scenes, which is fundamentally different from how the MPC handles stuff. Like, if I was to make a change, for instance, let's say I go into the step editor and remove a bunch of these hi-hats, that change will apply across every scene that this pattern is a part of, which is super nice to have. And of course, I can duplicate patterns to create changes between them, build up an arrangement that way. Once again, fundamentally different from how the MPC handles stuff. Once you've built up a bunch of scenes on Maschine, you can jump into song mode and start laying those out across your timeline, or just laying out a bunch of combinations of patterns, or launch individual patterns or entire scenes live. You can do the same with sequences on the MPC, but once again, those are a lot less flexible to work with, and you're starting to see the whole pattern of the Maschine workflow being more flexible than the MPC. Those are, in my mind, the biggest differences that you need to know about before choosing either device and either ecosystem. I like both for different reasons. I've enjoyed the user experience of both, and I would happily recommend either to beginners. Just bear in mind that the MPC has a bit of a steeper learning curve, but it's honestly not bad. And I do maintain that it will prepare you well to jump into other MPC stuff further down the line. That experience does translate, and don't let the comments tell you otherwise. But that's it. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to do a deeper dive into either device, I've got you covered. You can click or tap up over here, and I'll be back with a new video in a little bit. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching.